In the second half of today's material, we're going to broaden our discussion away from consciousness and into the intersection between neuro-AI and ethics. Why is this important? Well, in short, ethical considerations in neuro-AI are a quagmire. What if we create conscious AI? Then what? How can we possibly make AI safe, moral, responsible, fair, and how does neuro-AI play into these considerations? So the first of our ethics topics is going to center around a concept called moral status. Earlier today, we talked about all things consciousness. So let's pretend it's the future and we have built a machine that passes, or seems to pass, all of our tests for consciousness. What now? Should we treat it like a person? How about treating it like a monkey, or a dog, or a mouse, or an insect? Does the fact that it passed the test matter at all? To help us think through what happens next, let's hear from Josh Shepard, ICREA research professor at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona.
Okay, I want to introduce you to the concept of moral status. This is a notion that's at the core of some very important discussions in philosophical ethics and in bioethics, including the ethics of consciousness, and in neuroethics. Moral status is a technical term, the way that people deploy it in these conversations. It's a term that denotes that an entity's interests matter morally for that entity's own sake. So what are some of these items in this definition of moral status mean? Well, what is it for an entity to have interests? There's two ways we might think about interests. One is a kind of psychological state. So things that you desire, things that you have a preference for. These are things you're actually interested in. A broader notion of interests, and what's normally at issue here in these discussions of moral status, is more like things that are good for you, things that are in your best interest. So you might have no real actual interest in certain kinds of healthy food, no desires, no preferences, but eating those foods might actually be good for you, in your best interest. And so when we talk about moral status, we're interested in the quality of something's life, how best to treat them, what might make that life go well. These kinds of interests are typically what's at issue. A second question you can ask about this definition of moral status is, what is it for your interests to matter? Well, when we say that your interests matter morally, we mean you deserve moral consideration regarding how we treat you. That's just to say, it's a pretty bare baseline. We can't treat you as we would treat a stone or an old building or something that we don't care anything about or shouldn't care anything about. So this is just to say that solid reasons have to be given for using you in certain ways. This comes up in discussions of research protocols, of course, or in discussions of big agricultural farming of non-human animals. And it comes up in discussion of how we ought to treat perhaps potential artificial intelligences. Now, that's the technical term that most people agree on. That's the way to use the term moral status. But underneath this is a lot of disagreement about the structure of moral status. So one thing we can ask is, does moral status come in degrees? Do some things have more or less moral status than other things? We can also ask whether humans possess the highest level of moral status. And some people have thought, yes, humans do. Humans have full moral status. Other people have thought there's no such thing as full moral status. So you can increase the properties that give you moral status, and you can keep increasing them. And it might be possible to meet an alien intelligence or to develop an artificial intelligence that has much more moral status than human beings and could look at us rightly the way that we look, for example, at insects or something like that. So this raises an important question. The question is, why do some things have sakes? Why do some things matter morally? And here again, there's a lot of disagreement. I won't read this whole list that's on the slide there, but there's a number of different accounts of the grounds of moral status that have been offered. So some people say, well, you have moral status if you have self-consciousness. Other people point to phenomenal consciousness, and I'll talk more about that in just a second. Some people say, well, it's sophisticated psychological capacities that's the core thing. Some people say typical human capacities is the core thing. Some people say it's the capacity to participate in certain kinds of relationships or the capacity to have intentional agency. And this is not a complete list of all the different ways people have thought These are the things that ground moral status. So you can see there's a lot of energy going into how to understand moral status, and often not a lot of agreement lately in philosophical ethics. So what I want to focus on in the rest of this video is this issue of phenomenal consciousness, because this has occupied the most attention in the last few years in discussions of moral status. So we can ask, what aspects of phenomenal consciousness influence the level of moral status that some system possesses? And again, there's a number of different answers you might give here. I'm just going to walk through some of the most basic ones to give you a sense of how this discussion is evolving. You might say, well, here's the most important part of conscious experience. It's the valenced experiences we have, the affective experiences we have. So to say that experience has valence is just to say that it can be good or bad, or it can feel pleasant or unpleasant. And if you think that that's the crucial thing for moral status, then you want to start to look at what kinds of capacities for affect different systems have. You can look at humans and other animals. You can think about artificial intelligences in terms of whether potential experiences could be good or bad and how good or bad they might be. And you get to some interesting kind of dilemmas if you think in this way, because some systems might max out on these dimensions, might have very pleasant, very unpleasant experiences, even though they have relatively simple cognition. Of course, it's true that biological systems tend to balance positive and negative experiences to some degree, but this constraint might not hold for artificial intelligences. So you can imagine developing certain forms of artificial intelligence that don't have any bad experiences and only have positive experiences. And you can imagine then the response from this kind of view of the grounds of moral status saying, well, that's a much more important kind of system. That kind of system has to be promoted in our creation for moral reasons because the life of that system is so much better. That's a little outlandish, but that kind of thing is worth considering. So there's an important difference in recent philosophical discussion with respect to valence and affective experience. So I just want to mention two views that are out there, and there's a debate between them going on right now. Broad sentientism says that a being has moral status if and only if it has the capacity for phenomenal consciousness. So affect is not the most important thing here. If you're conscious at all, any kind of phenomenal consciousness, then you will have at least some moral status. Narrow sentientism instead says a being has moral status if and only if it has the capacity for affective phenomenal consciousness. So something that is phenomenally conscious but has no affect does not get into the moral status club. These views, I mention them because they offer importantly different guidance regarding the ethics of things like artificial intelligences or even cerebral organoids. So systems that meet certain markers for consciousness without meeting markers for valence experiences would have moral status, according to broad sentientism, but not narrow sentientism. So these views differ on whether meeting those kinds of markers might be morally significant, whether we ought to give those systems more detailed consideration, what kinds of policies we ought to have towards such systems, and so on. A different kind of view that moves away from valence says that combinations of phenomenal consciousness and cognition are very important to consider when you think about the level of moral status something might have. So just to illustrate this kind of view, there's actually a lot of different views that could fall under this general heading. You could think about a simplistic conscious entity, something like a snail. Maybe snails are conscious. And you could think about a sophisticated conscious entity, something like a bonobo. So you might hold that while both entities have some level of moral status, perhaps because they're both conscious to some degree, you might say the bonobo has higher moral status. And it's not just because it has a richer stream of consciousness. The bonobo has higher status because it's a more sophisticated system overall. So consciousness is not the whole story. The bonobo is able to participate in forms of life that have moral value, maybe the acquisition of knowledge, the development of social relationships, caring relationships, or whatever. A different alternative altogether is to say that, well, even if consciousness is important for moral status, it's possible to have moral status because you have cognitive sophistication alone. So on this view, even if phenomenal consciousness is relevant for understanding human moral status or biological moral status, cognitively sophisticated systems, like future artificial intelligences perhaps, may possess moral status even without phenomenal consciousness. These things might have self-consciousness, some level of awareness of the kinds of system that they are. They might value knowledge and seek to generate it or to produce it, and so on. And that's going to have a very different kinds of implications for how you want to treat that thing if that's your view about what grounds moral status. So in the end, moral status is a notion with important practical implications for policy, and it sits atop a number of difficult and unsettled issues in value theory and practical ethics, which gives a lot of importance to people working through how they feel about these issues and trying to understand what those implications are going to be.
And now for an activity. There are many reasons to ascribe moral status to some system, depending on your view of the grounds of moral status. But what is your view, your intuition, about what is important for moral status? Is it consciousness? Is it affective consciousness? Is it cognitive sophistication? Or something else? What would your view imply about how we approach the design of and interaction with different forms of artificial intelligence? Both rooms now are the same discussion topic.